Paul Glenn, and I want to welcome everyone. You are here at our GIPS panel, and we hope that you'll come away understanding a little bit more about the new GIPS 2020 standards. And we have certainly enough firepower here to tell you anything you want to know about GIPS to the extent it's been decided yet. I mean, if Karyn doesn't know the answer, then there is no answer. Otherwise, we have But anyway, we hope you enjoy this presentation. We have the materials are on the app, in the book, and we'll be seeing them on the screens as well. So anyway, that's what we wanted to get started with our first panel. But the way that we have it set up is GIPS 2020 is going to be talking about what they've been implemented. So the standards have been implemented that were effective January 1 of this year. So we're all in the process of applying them. And so we want to be as helpful to you in that as possible. One of the things that we sort of elected to do as a way to approach this is, well, what are the next 10 things that you need to do or think about? So we'll give you hopefully some advice and guidance along the way. So the new GIPS 2020 that's come out is actually 3 GIPS 2020s for firms. 2 is for asset owners, which is a new category by itself anyway. And thirdly, verifiers. So GIPS for verifiers, again, by itself anyway, that's been alluded to before. So that's the way it's set up. And when we get late at the end, basically slide number 39 is going to give you the website where you'll be able to achieve those. The other big piece, those of you who are watching GIPS 2020 and how it evolves, will be discovering what's in the GIPS handbook. Well, the GIPS handbook right now is about indicating 1 inch thick. So there's a lot of material in it, and that has to be revised as well. So on this website we'll talk about later, you can see section 1, and section 3, 2 is now available, and coming up shortly in Karyn's briefcase is section 4. So that should complete the extra information. So if you haven't had enough to read yet, there'll be more coming. So those are some of the things that just wanted to talk about as we go along. One of the questions I want to start with is just for us to know the audience is I want to ask you whether you're GIPS compliant, considering GIPS, or you are GIPS compliant, or you're not. So how many are not GIPS compliant? Oh, good. You all know what GIPS is. How about, are you considering GIPS, any of that category? So good one, considering, thank you. And how about that are GIPS compliant? Good, that seems to be our target audience. So we hope that this will be helpful for you. So excellent, thank you. And it's up there, good. So just in time to tell you who our panelists are. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, miss.
No, we're doing, so far you haven't missed anything on the slides, so you've been able to see us in person and hear us. That's great. So I just want to start out by introducing our panelists. And to my far left is Jed Schneider. And we're delighted to have Jed with us. And he's compliance performance, responsible for compliance and performance reporting at Lazard Asset Management in New York City. He has plenty of experience and background, having worked at JP Morgan's U.S. Private Bank Division, Morgan Stanley, U.S. Trust, and he was even, he also did, the Spalding Group he worked with as a senior verifier, so he has verifying experience as well. He also is chairs the Performance and Risk Committee of the CFA Society in New York, and I have the pleasure of being a co-member with him on the CFA's United States Investment Performance Committee. So, Jed, welcome.
Thank you.
And the next one is Grace Mann. And Grace is Senior Manager at Franklin Templeton Investments, where she leads a team responsible for GIPS compliance and composite maintenance. And in the past, she's worked at Callahan Associates. And she also served, same time I did, on the United States Investment Performance Standard Committee. And one of our claims to fame for grace for the Investment Advisor Association is she chairs our IAA GIPS Compliance Forum. We have meetings about 4 times a year by telephone. We've had illustrious speakers like Karyn before, and we encourage you to participate in that if you're eligible to do that. So I'm an attorney with the Investment Advisor Association, and I'm delighted to be leading this today. But in leading it, that's at least the name, but I want to turn it over for, I think we're up to our first slide, substantive slide here, which is going to be the first, what you've already teed up there. The 10 things that we're going to talk about, and then we're ready for the first one. Let me turn it over to Karyn to do that. Karyn?
Thanks, Paul. So today we're going to talk about some of the top 10 things that we think you should think about if you are transitioning from the 2010 edition of the GIPS standards to 2020. So we're just going to go through them one by one. First up, classification of portfolios. This is a new concept in 2020. So in 2020, there are different requirements for calculation, reporting, and everything depending on the portfolio type. All portfolios fall into 3 buckets. They're either going to be a segregated account, which is a client portfolio, or it's going to be one of 2 types of pooled funds. The pooled funds go into 2 buckets. They're either a broad distribution pooled fund, which is defined as a fund that's regulated under a framework that would permit the general public to purchase or hold shares, and it's not exclusively offered in one-on-one presentations. So those are going to be private funds, pretty much. Those are going to be retail funds, sorry. So the third bucket is what we call limited distribution pooled funds, and those are any pooled fund that is not a broad distribution pooled fund. So pretty much if it's a retail fund, it's going to be broad distribution pooled fund. If it's private, it's going to be limited. So first thing you need to do is define and determine which funds fall under limited distribution pooled fund category or broad. So as Paul mentioned, within the guidance, interpretive guidance of the GIPS standards, we have the documents we're calling explanation of the provisions. If you go on the GIPS website, there is a document that says, here is the document for the explanation of the provisions in section 1. And just a reminder that the GIPS standards fall into different sections based on provision numbers. So if you go to the explanation of the provisions for section 1, you see the guidance for provision 1A13, there's a table that lists about 11 or 12 different scenarios, which will help you determine which bucket your funds fall into, whether they're going to be considered limited or broad. There's a comment about
determining the classification for international products, especially for limited distribution pooled funds, can be really challenging. I think when you look at the broad distribution pooled funds, a lot of it is on your website. But when you look at the limited distribution pooled funds, they are unregistered funds, and generally they're not available on any website. So one of the things that we looked at is really kind of working with our legal department in regards to determining what are some of these international funds that might be offered. In the US, we pretty much know that it could be the 3C7s, the 3C11s, or the 3C1s. But I think trying to find the international funds was a little bit more challenging for a global firm.
And I'll add to that as well as you start to think about, I mean, and you know, Karyn mentioned this helpful table on determining limited versus broad, but for your firm to really sit down and look at what funds you have and make that determination and agree upon that determination. Because as we were going to speak a little bit more later about reporting to prospects for these funds, there are some things that you will need to do on the limited side that you may not necessarily have to do on the broad side, and to ensure that everybody in the firm knows what needs to be done going forward, especially sales and marketing folks. So today, this concept is new. So they need to understand the differentiations between the two and how to present that to a prospect.
Right, which leads into number 2, which is determine which GIPS reports will be used for your limited distribution pooled funds. There is no reporting requirement required for prospects for retail funds. You only have GIPS reporting requirements for segregated accounts and limited distribution pooled funds. So first, before we get into a few details, there are two types of GIPS reports. Right now, if you claim compliance with the GIPS standards, you're used to using this term compliant presentation, or CP. That's gone away. Now it's going to be a report specific to a composite or a report specific to a pooled fund. A composite report just includes information for a composite. A pooled fund report includes information for a specific fund. So in 2020, firms have to make every reasonable effort to provide the appropriate GIPS report to prospects. But when you are selling participation in a specific limited distribution pooled fund, there are two options. You can present either information about the specific fund, or if the fund is in a composite, you can present composite information instead. It's totally up to you which approach you take. But again, this is only required for limited distribution pooled funds, not for broad. So that's why it's so important to classify your funds appropriately. So determining which one it goes into is not really a straightforward exercise. So there are lots of operational considerations.
Yeah, so one of the things, and this was relatively new to me until about a year or so ago, was some of our limited distribution pool funds that are being marketed, or at least those strategies that are being marketed outside of the United States, we were not permitted to provide a pool fund presentation. We had to provide a composite or a strategy. So things like that, you need to take into consideration on which approach that you want to do. So it depends on the locations that you're marketing. And again, I'm not an expert by any means at certain locations, but something to keep in mind.
So then are you saying that potentially whether you use a pooled fund report or a GIPS composite report, it could differ if you're selling into the US or if you're selling into
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
yes.
The EU, for example.
Yeah, and in terms of looking at, whether you want to offer a GIPS composite report or a GIPS pooled fund report, the performance can be really different. And so one of the things that we did in terms of trying to determine which report to provide was to show those differences to our legal department in terms of the performance. Because when you have a composite, you actually have all these accounts with, you could use a model fee, you could use actual fees, whereas with a pooled fund report, you would actually have to show the vehicle performance, and there could be huge differences in terms of the performance you're showing. So Karyn, I have a question for you. If firms decide that they want to use a pooled fund report, usually composites will show month-to-month performance, whereas a pooled fund could incept in the middle of the month. So what should they do if they decide to use the pooled fund report?
So the pooled fund report, if you're including performance of only the pooled fund, it should start from the inception date of the fund. But that's different from the track record that may be included for that fund if you put it into a composite. So you could theoretically have different track records that you use depending on the purpose that you're using the fund for.
Thank you.
We're ready for, I have a question here for you. And that is, one of the things that you've gotten a takeaway from this GIPS appropriate report either can be a reporting composite, or it can be the actual results for your limited distribution pooled fund. So I'm going to ask you, are you going to do one way or the other? I'm going to give you a third choice. You can vote multiple times or to do both. But how many plan to give the actual performance results for your limited distribution pooled fund? You want a show of hands? I see at least one, two, okay, maybe more. How about, are you going to use the composite result for performance? See one back there, one there. I'm not going to ask you who don't know. I might ask you at the end. But and then how about are you going to do both of them for some reason? And that could be various ways. For example, maybe you're going to do quarterly reports actual for the limited fund, and then maybe you're going to have verified annual results that would be in a composite. In other words, it could be in both things. All right, anyone going to do something, both of them? Okay, well, how about people who don't know yet what they're going to do?
Yeah.
They're okay. That
Yeah.
really is a valid choice. So we have that one in there too. Thanks, because that can be helpful for you to understand where everybody is. Not that this is everybody, but it's big enough to be a sampling.
Yeah, so just one comment is that I think the approach that firms are going to take is potentially going to depend on whether they currently claim compliance and they're used to using a composite structure versus those that are newly coming into compliance. I think firms that are newly coming into compliance, if they manage pooled funds, they're just going to go just straight to the pooled fund report because they're not used to using composite. So I think it's really going to differ depending on what firms are doing today. And both approaches are fine. It's totally up to you, whatever works for you. So moving on, number 3, fee schedules and expense ratios. So in the GIPS report for a pooled fund, you have to include the fee schedule and the expense ratio, that's something new, for the limited distribution pooled fund that you're selling. And that applies whether you are using a pooled fund report that is specific just to that pooled fund, or if you are using a composite report. So you need to take a step back and say, okay, so what am I using this GIPS report for? What am I using it to sell? If it's a composite report and you're going to use that composite report both for segregated accounts and for a pooled fund that's included in the composite, then you're going to have to include fee schedules and expense ratios for the fund for everything. So it's going to be up to you to determine what information needs to go in there. But I think it's going to not be so straightforward, right, to do this and make that decision.
Yeah, and if you can go up to slide 12, we, some of the things I think about as a practitioner and systematically is we build GIPS composite reports today in a system. It has a fee schedule of that strategy, and now we have to start thinking about how we could tweak those composite reports to accommodate the pool fund prospect as opposed to the strategy prospect or separately managed portfolio prospect. Do we want to show all the fee schedules, potential fee schedules? Well, that could open up the question of, which one am I getting? Or do you just find a way to systematically pull out the fee schedule that's in there for the composite or the strategy and then insert it for the appropriate prospect? So there'll be some operational challenges depending on how large or how small or how your firm builds out GIPS presentations.
And this is going to be an easy task for your firm, right?
No, I think it will be pretty difficult. As a global firm, we don't really, provide the GIPS reports on a SharePoint site. So folks are able to kind of pull the reports that they need. So when you kind of really look at, the distribution or downstream distribution groups that have to use the reports, they really have to be educated in terms of understanding, well, which report should I show? Because I know that in our sales books, we have some nice performance charts in the middle of the sales books, and it usually shows the vehicle performance, and all of a sudden you're showing the composite report, and it has a different fee schedule, then sometimes people will compare those numbers. So when you think about it, your sales groups and your marketing groups really have to be educated because you want them to pull the right reports together, especially if you decide to use the GIPS composite report.
This is why I think firms that are one of the reasons why I think firms that are newly coming into compliance are going to skip the composite report for a limited distribution pooled fund. It's because of this fee schedule and expense ratio. I think it's a complicating factor. It's one of the downsides of continuing to use composite reports.
It is.
Yeah. Moving on to number 4, money-weighted returns versus time-weighted returns. So a time-weighted return is a return that is calculated on a period-by-period basis that reflects not only the change in value, but it removes the effect of contributions and withdrawals. So it's really trying to isolate the manager's performance. It's the returns that mutual funds use, for example. Contrast that with the money-weighted return, which is the return for a period that reflects the change in value and the timing and size of any external cash flows. That might be an internal rate of return, for example. And those returns are widely used in certain segments of the market, like private equity, for example. So in 2020, time-weighted returns must be used unless certain criteria are met. We have tried to add more flexibility to allow more and broader use of money-weighted returns. And the tests are, you can use only a money-weighted return in a GIPS report if, number one, your firm controls the cash flow, so you call the cash from your clients, and the fund or the accounts in the composite meet at least one of the following 4 characteristics. They're closed-end, they have a fixed life, they have a fixed capital commitment, or illiquid investments are a significant part of the strategy.
And for that, for 2020, obviously this changes from what we've seen in the past. Can you maybe explain a little bit?
Yeah, so in 2010, we had very limited use to use money-weighted returns. We allowed money-weighted returns to be used only for private equity funds or for closed-end real estate funds. Other than that, everybody had to do time-weighted returns. We've heard over and over and over that firms wanted to have more flexibility to use money-weighted returns because these nice black and white discrete buckets for putting investments in, they just don't really exist. So the example I used to give all the time when I was trying to make the pitch for why we should use money-weighted returns is, what if you manage a fund and it has 50% invested in S&P 500 stocks and 50% invested in oil drilling equipment? And this was back in my old days. I had a client, this is exactly what the fund was. So how do you calculate a time-weighted return on a monthly basis for something that has 50% invested in oil drilling equipment and that had a capital call commitment to it? So we just know that we needed a bit more flexibility. Does that answer your question about why we changed? Okay, so, but.
I just want to add an editorial comment that when we make comments to the CFA on GIPS 2020, that's one of the things we emphasize with flexibility. We're so happy that you've included so many options and flexibility for people. I think it's got to make the application of it more simple, and one of the other purposes for that was to broaden the scope as to who it applies to, too. They're trying to reach out to some of these other segments, asset owners and so on, that maybe hadn't been using it as much in the past.
Right, and just to generalize a little bit, what we've heard in the past from a lot of alternative managers, private equity managers, for example, is they pretty much said, you don't get us. We need money-weighted returns. That's what we use. Those are the returns that we want. And we don't use composites. We use funds. So with 2010, they just didn't see themselves in the standards. So we tried to make the next edition of the GIPS standards be a bit more applicable and more sort of welcoming to non-traditional money managers. But now there's going to be some flexibility to use more money-weighted returns, but there might be some challenges with that.
Yes, you can actually switch between using money-weighted and time-weighted returns now, but I think that if you do decide to make that switch, you know, you have to make sure if you're using a third-party administrator, that they can make that switch. But don't be surprised if your clients say, I like the old performance, can you show us both?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think from a composite calculation perspective, within a time-weighted frame, the standards allow several options on doing the calculation, and most firms, and probably most firms here, will tend to use an asset-weighted composite calculation, which takes, weights each portfolio accordingly on beginning market value or cash flows, and takes each portfolio's rate of return. You can't do that with money-weighted. It doesn't work. Money-weighted returns, you have to aggregate all the portfolios and then do the math. So it's a little bit different than what you're doing with time-weighted. So make sure your systems can accommodate this, especially if you have more than one portfolio in that particular composite.
And just to anticipate the question, if you do have time-weighted returns, yes, you can also include money-weighted returns in your GIPS report, so it's not one or the other. Number 5, creating lists of products. Right now, you have to maintain a complete list and description of composite descriptions, or a complete list of composite descriptions. So with these 3 different buckets of assets, you now have to maintain theoretically 3 lists: a list of composite descriptions, a list of limited distribution pooled fund descriptions, and a list of the broad distribution pooled funds, but you're not required to include descriptions of the retail funds or the broad distribution pooled fund. This is just information about the strategy of the vehicle. It also has to include information about the use of leverage and derivatives, and if illiquid investments are a material part of the strategy.
Oh, Karyn, I have a question for you.
Okay.
So in our firm, we have a lot of different vehicles and things, but we have limited distribution pooled funds where the client just hired us for a specific strategy. And there are times when we have just an internal fund that we're using perhaps for our other mutual funds. So do those, would they have to be included in this list of descriptions?
No, you only have to include on that list the vehicles that you're selling. So if it's an internal vehicle, then you don't have to include them on the list.
Right.
Yeah. Yes?
Question down here?
So if it's an internal vehicle, you're not including it on the list, but if it is a fund that you're managing for a client, is that also considered?
Yeah, so the question is, what if you have an internal fund that you're managing, so it doesn't have to be on the list, is that correct? That's right, it doesn't have to be on the list if you're not selling it, but that doesn't mean, that's still an asset that is going to be included in total firm assets, so you still have to include it in a composite if it meets the composite definition. So you don't get to ignore it for that purpose. Just for the list purposes, you can exclude it, because it would be included within the composite description. So you have to provide these lists upon request, and you also, which nobody asks you for it anyway, right? I get it. So, but you also have to include a broad distribution pooled fund description upon request. You can also tailor these lists to the prospect. If somebody, for whatever reason, asks you for the list, if somebody from Switzerland asks you for the list of limited distribution pooled funds, you can just give them the list of funds that they qualify for, given their country of residence. You don't have to give them a list of the funds that they're not able to invest in. And then you can also use the firm's website for the list of broad distribution pooled funds if you include all your funds on your website. So I know you're looking forward to creating these lists, Grace, because on a global basis.
It is challenging in regards to creating these lists, especially on a global basis. But I think for our broad distribution pool funds, there's a lot of information that's already on the website, including for our global countries. So that's positive.
Yeah, I think we'll be challenged a little bit with a limited, but I think if we just organize and get ahead of the game, we should be fine.
So one option you might want to consider is sort of creating a combined list. And have a list of your strategy descriptions. So, here's a description of our small cap strategy, and then have a separate, piece that says these are the vehicles that this strategy is available in. It's available in a, mutual fund, a limited distribution pooled fund, a CCAV, or whatever it is. So, depending on how your firm is set up, you might want to take that approach as well. So it doesn't have to be 3 separate discrete lists. You can combine them if you want.
Karyn, one of the issues that I know Grace has talked with me about somewhat is that having that list, a lot of the distributions for limited pooled funds, for example, are offered on a private placement basis. And one of the things that you're doing there is you're trying to make sure you don't hit these triggers that the SEC say, well, it's a public distribution, therefore you have to go through the whole registration process. And in doing that, you don't want indicia that it's publicly available. So there may be pressure to restrict the list so that you'd only let them know about ones that they'd be eligible for if they could buy them or something. And if they aren't a qualified investor, maybe they shouldn't have the whole list. Do people handle that issue, or do they have any special things that they should be thinking about, or is that valid restriction?
I think it's a valid restriction. You, as a GIPS compliant firm, you have an obligation to comply with any laws and regulations regarding the calculation and presentation of performance. So any legal requirements is going to, I'm not going to use the word Trump, is going to override the restrictions for, or for the guidance that's required for the GIPS standards.
And within our group, for our limited distribution pooled funds, we actually have a group that does that qualification. So it would be pretty simple for us to just give them the list, and they can do the qualification if needed.
Anything to add, Jed?
Nope.
Nope, okay.
You guys covered.
All right. Number 6, think you should look at all your composite definitions and take a fresh look at them. So that's because we have some different requirements as far as what needs to go in a composite in 2020. So first, what is a composite definition? A composite definition, it includes the detailed criteria that determine the assignment of portfolios to composites. So which accounts go in which composites for which time period. So in 2020, you have to create a composite and an associated composite definition, and this is key, for all strategies that are managed for or offered as a segregated account. So if you have, you're an equity manager and you have one money market account or money market strategy that, I'm gonna skip that example right now. So forget that, let's just move on. So when you have to look and say, what are the strategies that I offer for a segregated account? And those are the accounts that need to go into a composite. And when you put those in a composite, you have to include all portfolios that meet the composite definition. In 2020, you can't exclude portfolios from composites based solely on legal structure differences. So if you manage a pooled fund and a segregated account exactly the same, they need to go in the same composite. So under 2010, with this sort of mess that we did where we didn't really allow you to sell an individual fund, we sort of let you create single fund composites that included only a single fund. Now we're saying you should not and you can't create differences based on legal structure. If they're all managed the same, they all need to go in together. You also can't differentiate accounts that go in composites based on investment management fee differences. So you can't say, oh, I'm going to exclude from my composite all my small cap accounts who have a fee greater than 50 basis points or that pay a performance-based fee. Can't do that either. So it really comes down to you just can't exclude a pooled fund from a composite just because you want to. So a pooled fund needs to be included in any composite if it meets the composite definition. And I'm just going to move on to number 7, which is why I said let me just come back to this, which is because you only have to create a composite for strategies that are offered as a segregated account, if you have previously included funds in a composite, and that's the only thing that was in a composite, under 2020, you can kill them if you don't offer that strategy as a segregated account. So, for my example, if you are an equity manager, but you have one short-term fixed income fund that you use as a holding in your segregated accounts, you don't sell participation in that fund. It's those internal funds that Grace was talking about. You don't have to create a composite that includes the fund if the fund's strategy is not offered as a segregated account. Does that make sense? Yes? So the question is, what if you have a fund and you've got clients that, even though you're not selling it, but the clients ask you to invest in, to manage their fixed income? Then I'd say you are managing accounts for a segregated account. So you have to figure that out. If you don't offer the strategy and say, okay, back up a second. It gets a little confusing. But for a fund, I think in that instance, you could potentially say, okay, well, if you're selling participation in the fund, you can just give them a fund report, right? But you don't have to create a composite for it because you're not offering that as a segregated account. So that's really what you need to differentiate. Hope that makes sense. Okay. So if you have, yes? Pooled fund. Yeah, so the question is, what if you create a single member LLC for an individual client? Is that considered a pooled fund or a segregated account? I'd say it's a segregated account because you're not offering shares of that fund to others. It's really just for the individual client. Okay? Anything to add on that? Yeah. So anyway, so you have to look and say, okay, so what am I going to do with any composites that include only one or more funds when I don't offer those as a segregated account? So you have to figure out what you're going to do. You can keep them if you want, or you can terminate them, but you have to think about what's the right answer in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Does it, if you have a single composite, single account composite you've created for a fund that you have, and you're not actively marketing it or actively deeming it a strategy for separately managed portfolios, as Karyn mentioned, you could actually now terminate that composite. But you also have to ask yourself, well, 2 years from now, maybe it will be a strategy that you're interested in marketing to, or offering to a separately managed portfolio. So, does it save time? Does it save money by shutting down a composite? If there's a cost associated with it, you have to weigh out that cost. If it's very simple just to grab that number, put it into a composite, create the presentation quarterly or annually, and there's not much effort there, I'm not sure if it necessarily hurts to take it away. And you have to decide as a firm whether or not you want to shut these composites down, but at the end of the day, you may need that down the road.
Karyn, let me ask I don't know if it's a clarifying or confusing question, but it used to be that you had to have, everything had to be GIPS compliant, either all or none. Now, the example we had here where you just have a few isolated bonds or something, you're sticking them in some separate account. Can you say that's an account, we just don't claim GIPS compliance for that? Or because we don't do debts, we're only GIPS compliant on all of our equities? How much flexibility is there?
There's not that much flexibility,
Okay.
So right.
I wanted to
Yeah.
see where the lines are here. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
right. You still have to be in compliance on a firm-wide basis. It's just there's a little bit more flexibility about not being required to include all actual fee-paying discretionary portfolios in a composite. You only have to put them in a composite if that strategy is managed for or offered as a segregated account. We're really just trying to differentiate the fact that you manage accounts for clients and you manage pooled funds. And so just to not force the pooled funds to be treated like a segregated account if all you're doing is selling participation in those funds. That's really the difference. Does that work?
Thank you.
Okay. Carve-outs. So in the GIPS standards, a carve-out is defined as a portion of a portfolio that is by itself representative of a distinct investment strategy. For example, the small cap segment of an equity portfolio. There's been a lot of changes with how carve-outs have been treated historically, but no matter what has happened, if you decide to carve out a portion of a portfolio, number one, it has to be representative of a standalone portfolio that is managed or intended to be managed according to that strategy. So if you have a global equity portfolio, you can't just carve out your 2 French stocks from that portfolio and say, I have a French equity strategy, because that wouldn't be representative of a standalone portfolio managed or intended to be managed to that strategy. So that's the first step. It has to represent a real strategy. Number 2 is if you do decide to carve out a portion of a broader portfolio, you have to include cash and cash-related income in the returns of that carve-out. So we've changed our mind over time, and prior to 2010, you used to be able to allocate cash to the segment that you're carving out. So if the equity portion represented 30% of a balanced portfolio, you could allocate 30% of the cash, and then have a proper return for inclusion in a composite. In the 2010 edition, we said, no, you can no longer allocate cash. You can only have a carve-out if you give that carve-out its own cash. That's the only way you can use that carve-out and put it in a composite. But we changed our minds once again. Well, I like to think that saner heads prevailed, and we say, okay, that was a mistake, and we say that once again, firms are allowed to allocate cash to carve-outs, and you can do it for all periods. So you can, if you have been putting cash in the carve-out, you can continue to do that, or if you want to allocate cash, you can do that as well. And you can take either approach for any period you want. So the key, though, is if you decide to allocate cash to a carve-out and include it in a composite, this is a big change. You have to do that for all carve-outs within the firm. So if you allocate cash to one small cap segment from all your equity portfolios, you have to create that carve-out with the allocated cash across all of them. There are also some additional reporting responsibilities if and when you eventually get a standalone portfolio, like a small cap only account. You have to create a composite that includes only the standalone portfolios, and you have to report performance of the composite that includes only the standalone portfolios along with the carve-out composite, because you want somebody to be able to understand whether the performance of the carve-out with allocated cash really does indicate performance of a standalone portfolio. So, but those requirements to create that standalone composite don't apply to carve-outs that have their own cash. It's only when you allocate cash. I mean, really what it comes down to is if you want to allocate cash to a carve-out, you've got to do a whole bunch of additional work to do it, to take advantage of this new requirement. So there are, you have to figure out how you're going to handle cash, and there are different things you have to think about from a cash allocation method or marketing options. So do you guys want to talk about some of those?
Grace?
In terms of cash allocation?
Yeah, but just about the good and the bad for allocating cash, yeah.
It is a tremendous amount of work just to do carve-outs, but we're probably more conservative firm where, you know, we probably look at it and we go, you know, there's going to be a lot of disclosures, you know, required for it, no matter how you want to cut and dice this. So, you know, I think that's the one comment that I would have in regards to carve-outs.
Are you guys going to use carve-outs, do you think, with allocated cash?
We will not use carve-outs right now, currently, where we have two sets of portfolios that have what I'll call sleeves. So we have multi-asset type of strategies where we have sleeve portfolios that represent into the multi-asset strategy, and each of those portfolios or sleeves have their own cash, and so they have their own manager. And then we have another component where we have balanced portfolios where the fixed income has its own cash bucket. So we're actually in good shape. I'm you know, carving out cash, and I want to add one more thing to Grace. Have good policies and procedures on how you're calculating your cash component, because you want to stay consistent with that. And so that's a part where it's tricky, and then sometimes you have to apply something outside of your performance system to actually do that, so it becomes a challenge.
Yeah, this becomes an Excel exercise,
yes.
You know, and I think that one of the biggest challenges firms are going to face if they decide to do this is identifying all accounts that need to be carved out. So it's, for example, if somebody says, okay, I want to create a carve-out of my high yield positions. So you have to look across all your portfolios and figure out what the high yield segments are, and how do you have every single security actually classified appropriately, so you know whether it fits into the high yield segment or not. The devil is in the details here when it comes down to this. So I think it's great that we have the option for using carve-outs going forward, but it's just an option. Don't feel that you need to do this if you're just totally happy with what you're doing now. So if you're a JEDS firm and you're all set with your sleeves, then you can just keep going with that. Okay, number 9, creating GIPS reports. So in 2020, there are 4 options for GIPS reports. There are 2 for composites, one that includes a composite with time-weighted returns, a second with composite that includes money-weighted returns. There are 2 options for a pooled fund report. One includes time-weighted returns, and one includes money-weighted returns. And again, what am I talking about with a GIPS report? It's the report that has, you know, up to 10 years worth of data usually, and then a whole series of disclosures. So in 2020, sections 4 to 7 are repetitive, and that's done very much on purpose. And that's because we want each report section to stand alone. So if you're preparing a composite report that includes time-weighted returns, you only have to look at section 4. You don't even have to look at the others. And there is on the website, under tools and resources, there's a comparison table which lines up all the requirements across the 4 different options, so you can see whether the requirements are the same for all 4 reports or if they're different. So it just helps you figure out which reports have differences. So firms need to determine which returns will be presented for each composite and each pooled fund that goes in a GIPS report. And once you determine that, you have to consistently present the selected returns. So what you can't do is say, oh, I'm going to do money-weighted returns this month, and oh, next month I'm going to do time-weighted returns, then flip-flop back and forth. You need to figure out which one you're going to do. But again, there are going to be some challenges, particularly around composite and pooled fund inception date, which this is a new required disclosure. Do you want to talk about the inception date for a second and the challenges that you see?
Yeah, I'll add. I had a couple of challenges when I was reading 2020 GIPS standards and going through the comment period. One of the things was one of the challenges I think firms may have with inception date, or now having to report or provide strategy inception date, is that one, GIPS presentations, you're only required to go back 10 years. So if you have a strategy and a composite that may go back 15 years and you're required to show your inception date 15 years ago, but you're only showing 10 years of data, what's the first question maybe a prospect may ask is, why aren't you showing the last 5 years of data? So it's things that you need to consider as a firm to say, well, now I'm showing the strategy inception date, how do I articulate to the prospect why I'm not showing the additional 5 years of data? The other component are for newly formed firms, GIPS firms, that are only required to go back 5 years to start to claim compliance, and their strategy may go back further, how they actually handle that. So their inception date may go back further than the original 5 years, and how do you explain that to a prospect?
Okay. Another thing you need to consider is we have these concepts called sunset disclosures, where you can eliminate some disclosures after they've been included for at least a year if you determine that they're no longer relevant to interpreting the track record. I think there's 5 of those. There's some additional flexibility around reporting advisory-only assets and uncalled committed capital. And we have a few other items that you're going to need to look at. For example, we have a new compliance statement, and there's a new required trademark disclosure.
So, Karyn, for sunset disclosures, we're really happy that we can eliminate some things that have grown over time. And I know, like, our firm definition is almost half a page because of all these mergers over the years. Would we be able to eliminate some of the things from our firm?
Well, the sunset disclosures are the disclosures that we say you can explicitly, remove them after a year if they're no longer relevant. Now, what you're talking about, I think, is just taking a fresh look at your disclosures and figuring out whether we can update them. So a lot of large firms have a firm definition that just goes on for a page because they've grown over time and they've made changes and they've consolidated. You don't have to keep the same disclosure forever. I think that this would be a great time to take a fresh look at all your disclosures and say, do we really need to disclose an acquisition that we did in 1987? It's probably a little dated at this point, So now would be a good time to do that.
That'd be great.
Yeah. So there's also a new we provide guidance that says that if you are updating GIPS reports monthly or quarterly to add year-to-date returns, you are required to only update the composite or the pooled fund return, the benchmark returns, and any significant events. Some firms have thought that they've had to update every single item in the table, and that's not true, not on a quarterly basis. So one other thing is we said that there's a new requirement to update GIPS reports to include information that is no more than 12 months old, effectively. So if you are reporting performance now, you can't have the most recent data be 2 years ago. You have to add more current information. So just for the sake of time, I'll just zip to number 10, which is just the last thing we'd recommend is for you to review the GIPS standards for verifiers. Verifiers are those independent third parties that do testing of your firm's policies and procedures for complying with the GIPS standards. We have a separate chapter devoted to verifiers that include new, very detailed tests that the verifier has to do. But from the firm's perspective, the firm really has to understand the verifier's policies for maintaining independence, because it doesn't help to have somebody doing testing if they're actually testing their own work. So a firm is required to gain an understanding of the verifier's policies for maintaining independence.
And if we're asking our verifier for to see their policies, is there anything else a firm should be doing besides taking a look at those policies?
So there is a document called the Guidance Statement for Verifier Independence. That document is very close to being updated, and it will be issued shortly. And so I would recommend looking at that document because it gives some more details around what the firm needs to do and what the verifier needs to do for ensuring the verifier is independent. Also, the test that a verifier needs to perform, you should be familiar with it to make sure that your verifier is actually doing the testing that they should be doing. If your verifier is spending, 4 hours with you, I promise you they're not doing the work that they need to do. So, and I'm not saying that anybody does that, but I think it would be helpful for you to look at the test that they have to do because it would help you prepare for verification as well. Jeb, did you want to have anything to add on that? Or?
No, I think we're good. At least on next slide, I have a question.
Okay.
Oh, actually, no, I'm sorry. We passed that slide. You're right. Absolutely, I have a question. So this is if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's around to hear it, it doesn't make a sound. So if there's a material error that you discover in a GIPS compliant presentation, whether it be pool fund or composite, and that presentation has not been provided to a prospect yet, do you still need to tell the verifier?
No. No, you don't. If you have not provided it, it's only when you've provided it and you have the requirement to redistribute the corrected GIPS report.
Karyn, one other question about the verifiers. When do these things go into place for them? So if we have all this year for regular calendar year users that will be under GIPS 2020, so when is there anything now the verifiers need to be doing? I think your point is very well taken that you should find out what they're going to be looking for so you're prepared to deliver it, but then they'll start their work, and then how long do they have to get it done? And you already mentioned how stale the numbers can be, but
yeah.
When does it have to be verified by?
So the new guidance for verifiers applies whenever the verifier is doing an engagement that is for a firm that claims compliance with 2020. So what do I expect? This year, everything's still going to be under 2010, but next year when the firm, prepares their 2020 materials and they're being verified for 2020 and they're in compliance with 2020, that's when the verifier has to apply those rules.
Now, if they've started now and they're going to be doing it quarterly and having reviewed quarterly, would they have to?
Same.
Yeah.
It depends when the firm that they're verifying claims compliance under 2020. It's all synced up together.
Okay.
So those are the top 10, but we have a few wrap-up comments.
Yes, I know that after looking at the top 10, you go, wow, that's already a lot of things to do. But one of the things I would say is that early communication is really important, particularly if you have to make system changes. Sometimes it takes the group that's making systems changes time to do it. But we also find that we really have to talk to a lot of different groups. We talk to our legal group, our marketing groups, our product management groups, in regards to a lot of these GIPS 2020 changes. But what we found is that we couldn't just do one discussion. With our private equity, we actually had 3 separate discussions talking about these changes. So early communication is really, really important. There are changes in regards to advertising, so just be aware that in terms of the marketing groups that you work with, that they're aware of what these changes are. I think there were a lot of requirements for 2010, and I think with 2020, there's been a lot of relaxation of these requirements. So I think that really kind of helps on the real estate in terms of what needs to be included. And in regards to the sales books, be sure that you indicate where the location of the GIPS reports are. Usually we do that in the table of contents. One of the things we did as a firm was that for supplemental information, we used to mark almost every single page as supplemental information. It no longer applies. So that's another disclosure that firms can remove in terms of their sales books. And then once you kind of make all these decisions from these implementation tasks, update your policies and procedures. I would find it hard that you don't really need to update anything, but if you take a look at the standards, the provisions, the explanations, there will be some things you will need to update. And then determine your firm's implementation date and just be prepared. But communication is probably the most important thing. Jed, did you want to add anything?
You're spot on, especially with the very, very last bullet point, is the communication and preparing your firm in this year, and the marketing sales teams, compliance teams, performance teams, everybody who's touching some aspect of GIPS, to know that when they come around in 2021 that they're presenting to a prospect the appropriate way and understand those changes. But I think, yeah, not even operational teams, everybody needs to be prepared. So.
Yeah, so just to make sure everybody's crystal clear, assuming you present performance on a calendar year basis in your compliant presentations, which will become GIPS reports, you have to comply with 2020 in your GIPS reports when you include performance that ends on or after 31 December 2020. So if you do calendar year reports in 2021, when you're updating for calendar year 2020, that's when you have to comply. So you don't have to comply until next year in your reports. Okay?
Yes. And this is slide 39. I said we would be telling you about where to find all these resources. You want to give it more personal update there?
Yeah, cfainstitute.org, right? Go click under standards. So again, we're working on explanations of each of these provisions. So it's in a document called Explanation of the Provisions. So far, we have issued those explanations for sections 1, 2, and 3, but those are really the fundamentals of compliance. So that's really like the key bits that you need to know. And those are available on the website and under Tools and Resources, and hopefully you'll find that guidance helpful. We are close to issuing section 4, which is the GIPS composite report for time-weighted returns, which will be for most of you, and then we're working on the others, and we'll get those issued as soon as possible in the future.
Well, with that, we've reached the end of our time, and I want to thank each of our panelists. Karyn Vincent, Senior Head Global Industry Standards at GIPS Standards, Executive Director at the CFA Institute, and for Jed Schneider, Senior Vice President, GIPS Compliance and Reporting at Lazard Asset Management, and Grace Mann, Senior Manager at Franklin Templeton. And join me in thanking them, and you've been a great audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.